Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on this session on Can Trade Shape Africa's Post-COVID Recovery. It's hosted by the Kozul-Wright Institute for Africa as part of the LSE Festival 2022. I am David Luke, a professor in practice at the Kozul-Wright Institute for Africa here at the LSE, and I'm chairing this session. I'm joined by a two-person panel who I will briefly introduce, as you can find further details on our website. Rebecca Greenspan, UNCTAD Secretary General, is not able to join us today as planned. She is represented by Richard Kozul-Wright, who is Director of UNCTAD's Globalization and Development Strategies Division. Richard is our main speaker and will share his views on the role that trade can play in Africa's post-COVID recovery, against the background of low expectations for global growth following the Russia-Ukraine war and the related economic shock that is characterized by an inflationary spiral driven by primarily by higher food and energy prices. Welcome, Richard. Our second panelist is Teniola Tayo, who is an LSE alumna and a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Dakar. Most of all, Teniola represents the upcoming African generation whose lives and livelihoods will be shaped by today's policy responses to post-COVID recovery and the current global economic shock. She will provide commentary on Richard's presentation and share her own thoughts on the role trade can play in shaping Africa's response to the recovery, future growth, and economic transformation. Welcome, Teniola. The event is being recorded. It is on Facebook live stream. For those who wish to tweet about the event, the Twitter hashtag is LSE Festival. Let me say that again. Hashtag LSE Festival as one word. Please use the Zoom Q&A function for your comments and questions. Without further ado, I'll give Richard the floor. He will speak for 15 minutes, followed by Teniola, who will speak for 10 minutes. After that, there'll be a brief exchange among the panel as I follow up on some key issues in their respective interventions and invite further comments from each of them. It's my expectation that half of the time we have for this session, about 30 minutes, will be devoted to Q&A, which will allow you, the audience, to interact with the speakers and engage in debate on the issues. So let's get started. And as we do so, I just want to note that early this morning, the WTO 12th Ministerial Conference did reach some interesting agreements, important agreements on fisheries, on the TRIPS waiver, although it did not go as far as expected, and a few other areas. I'm sure that Richard and Tenny would want to touch on these as well. So now, Richard, let me give you the floor, and you have about 15 minutes. You have the floor.
Okay, David, thank you very much. And again, apologies for SG Greenspan not making up. We are caught up in the issue around Ukraine war and its impact on developing countries, and that's sucking a lot of oxygen out of our atmosphere at the moment. So apologies for that. Let me, to the best of my ability, try and step into her shoes and give at least my take on the issue of can trade shape Africa's post-COVID recovery. What we certainly know is that trade has shaped Africa's past economic history, that's for sure, and not always for the better either. That's also true. And I think in the context of the title, it's important to note that can trade shape Africa's recovery is slightly different, but it often gets confused with the question, can trade liberalization shape Africa's future? These are not necessarily the same things, although they often get confused with each other. Let me just set it in the kind of bigger context that you raised, David, about the current economic moment in which this question arises, and the overall growth picture for the region. I mean, Africa, probably more than any other developing region, its growth prospects are shaped by outside factors. I think that that's something we know. And the two big factors that have shaped it over the last decade, more than the last decade really, have been what happens to on commodity markets. I mean, that's an older history, obviously, that in the work, of course, UNCTAD has been looking at this question since its creation in the early 1960s. It became particularly important in the early 2000s for Africa, which was the period of a growth renaissance on the continent from around 2002 to, I guess, around 2014. There was a strong growth recovery across the continent, even with the global financial shock. And it's important to recognize that and think why that happened. The other big factor, external factor, of course, that has shaped Africa's economic prospects for a long time, but particularly in this period, is the access to finance and the question of the role of international finance in the shaping of its growth process. I think there's no doubt that the successful efforts to reduce debt through HIPC initiatives at the end of the last millennium, the beginning of the 2000s, along with the deregulation of international financial markets, at least was an important factor of Africa's return to international capital markets, and that contributed for a period to the strong growth in from the early 2000s to around 2014. Importantly, of course, these two factors, commodities and finance, are very much on everybody's minds as a consequence of the war in Ukraine and the impact of the war on commodity prices and on the cost of finance is an issue that we need to come back to. So I would say, of course, that after 2014, the growth across the continent began to slow. Noticeably, that's before COVID-19 hit. Growth was already slowing down on the continent. There were already very serious concerns that we had in UNCTAD about rising levels of indebtedness in the continent and the servicing of debt. A large number of African countries were already classified as either at a high level of debt distress or actually in a situation of debt crisis by the IMF. So already before COVID, there were some real serious concerns, and COVID itself was a much more damaging shock. Again, an external shock, something that was not caused by the continent itself, but it was a much more damaging shock than was the global financial crisis for the African region. So it's a very uneven growth process, a growth picture over the last 2 decades, but one that it has deteriorated since the middle of the last decade, and there are real concerns looking forward that we will have to, I think, talk about. I think it's from the trade angle, of course, it's important to recognize that Africa is a very open economy. I mean, if you take exports and imports as a share of GDP, it's I think as a continent, it's very much at the developing country average, and some countries are well above the average. Of course, most of the region is a heavily commodity dependent trade profile. So most countries are highly specialized in terms of what it is that they export, with a concentration on either fuel, minerals, or agricultural exports. And indeed, if you look at the region as a whole, it is probably the most specialized region in the global economy. It's a region that has been liberalizing since at least the mid-1980s. Both through free trade agreements, through the multilateral process, but probably more importantly than anything else, through the adoption of structural adjustment programs in the lending through lending at the Washington-based institutions, which, as we know, have come with very significant policies attached to them, of which trade liberalization is always an important component. So SAPs have been, I think, the major vehicle for liberalization across the continent, but free trade agreements have also been a very important part of that opening up story. We know the AGOA and the EPAs and the other features of that I'm sure you're more familiar with than I am. We tend to think that the benefits of those kinds of agreements have been exaggerated for the continent. I mean, there are certainly positives. They tend to be associated with a greater ability to attract foreign direct investment. They go in hand, and we can have a discussion about what that means, I guess. But that's certainly has certainly been a feature of the continent since the early 1990s. They, on the other hand, they tend to squeeze down policy space and fiscal space, and both those issues have been exposed quite viscerally during the COVID-19 shock, where many African countries clearly lack the policy and fiscal space to respond to that shock in an effective fashion. So I guess, I think it's very important to emphasize that dependence on the region of these external factors that have a profound impact through both growth and through both trade and financial avenues on the prospects looking ahead, and that hasn't changed, I think, as a consequence of the shock of the war in Ukraine. I think for us, then the way we try and get a handle on the question of whether trade can shape Africa's recovery in a positive way, looking forward, is to look at. I mean, I guess we look at trade obviously in UNCTAD from a developmental point of view. I mean, trade can bring benefits through competitiveness, through increased efficiency, through its links to foreign direct investment. Those are all potentially positive channels. The question, I think, for us is whether it leads to the kind of transformative growth path that we associated with a long and sustained upward improvement in living standards and the welfare of the majority of the population. And I think, I mean, and there are very serious questions, I think, to be asked about the recent history of Africa's insertion into the global economy, if that is the lens that you look at it from. And I think in particular, the hyper-specialization of the continent, although it did contribute to growth in that decade or so from the early millennium, went hand in hand with two features that we think are now in a way coming back to haunt the continent and will have a profound impact on whether trade does act in a positive way over the remainder of this decade. The first is the tendency of industrial development to either stagnate or suffer from what we, along with other people, Danny Roderick and other people, have called premature deindustrialization. That is the loss of industrial capacity at a level of income where the opposite should be happening. And that's a feature across the continent, I think. And we think that's a particularly damaging feature of Africa's growth path over the last couple of decades. And the other feature that we think is associated with some of the trends that I've talked about with respect to trade has been a weakening of capital formation across the continent. That is, investment shares in most African countries have essentially been stagnant since the middle of the 1980s. They've rarely, I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but in most cases, it's rarely moved above 20% of GDP, which we see for countries at the level of income of most African countries, certainly sub-Saharan African countries, needs to be significantly higher than that figure. And so this more open, this more liberal, this more specialized environment that has been established, all of which, if you believe standard trade models, should be generating prosperity and dynamic growth, has not really led to that, because the structure of the economy of the economies have not been dynamic, and one of the key drivers of sustained economic growth, namely capital formation, has suffered significantly during these years. And foreign direct investment has not, either in terms of volume, has not compensated for that, or in terms of direction, because again, most of that foreign direct investment has been associated with commodity, the commodity dependent economies. On top of that, and I think I'm sure it's a feature that you're all familiar with and have talked about extensively, foreign direct investment has been associated with the rise of illicit financial flows from the continent. Measuring illicit financial flows is, of course, by definition difficult. That's because they're illicit. But figures in the region of 80, 90, 100 billion dollars a year are common in terms of the continent. We are UNCTAD is currently engaged in efforts to try and provide better measurement of illicit financial flows. It's a difficult thing to do, but this is a huge problem in terms of lost resources for the continent, which again, although is not directly associated with the trading environment, is in many respects linked to it. And I think that's a big challenge that needs to be, when we're talking about trade, and this again is a very UNCTAD type of perspective on it, we don't think it's helpful to talk about trade in a very siloed fashion. You have to link trade to the financial environment. You have to link it to the balance of payments situation. And one of the features of this more open economies across Africa, of course, is that imports have increased much more rapidly than exports over the course of the last 2 decades. Balance of payments deficits have been rising. Those are filled, of course, by borrowing. Borrowing ultimately comes with the servicing of the debt. The servicing of the debt depends upon the strength of growth performance. A weakening growth performance is guaranteed to make debt servicing a further burden on government finances and resource mobilization efforts. So those kinds of linkages, I think, need to be fed very intimately into the trade story if we're going to understand its potential role as a source of recovery post-COVID. In terms of what we would like to see, I guess, it's a standard kind of UNCTAD wrap. Given that we don't think leaving things to markets tends to work out favorably for most developing countries, particularly developing countries with a long history of structural deficits of one kind or another, then the role of the developmental state becomes particularly important. The role of industrial policy becomes particularly important within that question of what the developmental state needs to do. And I think most people would argue that there has been a hollowing out of state capacities across Africa in the context of structural adjustment programs. And I think without some reversal of that trend and the building up of new capacities, then finding a sustainable route, one that addresses the structural weaknesses and increasingly addresses the climate problem, which is something that we haven't talked about but probably should, because that has a profound impact on the continent, is very important. In that context, I know there's a lot of hope that small and medium-sized enterprises will somehow power a new growth path in Africa. I think Africa's problem is as much the lack of large firms as it is of small firms. International trade is incredibly heavily dominated by very large firms, and you look at concentration rates in international trade, then the top 5% of firms, large international firms, dominate most markets in international trade, and that makes competing in those markets all the more difficult Value chains, to some extent, offer some potential in that context, and that there's a big debate to be had about the role of global value chains in this story. Commodities themselves have been structured around global value chains since, the 17th century. So value chains per se do not spell successful trade and growth relationships, but there are opportunities there. We've been arguing recently quite extensively that we need to explore regional value chains as an alternative there, and what that might mean in terms of policy that is required to build regional value chains. Obviously, the continental free trade area for Africa figures into that, and whether the way in which that is evolving offers opportunities to build regional value chains of the sort that would lead to more sustained economic growth. We are all aware that intra-African trade is very low, but that's an obvious consequence of the structure of the economies. If you're producing lots of copper and your neighbor's producing lots of maize, there's not very much room for intimate trade relations there. On the positive side, to the extent that African countries do trade in manufactures amongst themselves, they tend to be more dynamic parts of the manufacturing chain that do get traded. So there are real opportunities, I think, that we see with the CFTA. But again, simply putting up tariffs and hoping things will work out is not probably the right strategy to take. You need a lot of coordination. You need space for implementing industrial policies that work for both you and your neighbors, and you need financing, appropriate levels of financing, to make sure that capacity does evolve in the right direction. So we certainly look forward to seeing these opportunities flourish in the context of the CFTA. I think though, we do also, and we engage with the Secretariat of the CFTA quite closely. We do encourage them to think not simply in terms of tariffs, but also in terms of policy options and the need for strategic thinking when it comes to giving a developmental dimension and not just a free trade dimension to the CFTA. Let me leave it there, David.
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Richard. I have to say that it's somewhat something of a bleak picture you painted, but I think it's also a realistic picture. And I'll turn the floor over to Teniola. As I said in the introduction, Teniola belongs to a generation that will have these issues as a legacy that they will have to deal with. So Teniola, over to you to see what your thoughts are on this realistic picture, I think sobering picture that Richard has painted. Over to you, Teniola.
Thank you, Professor David Luke. So yes, a sobering picture, but then these are some of the questions that we ought to be asking ourselves and then coming up with very pragmatic answers rather. So yes, it's true that trade shapes economies, right? So it determines incomes and wealth, but also to a large extent, it determines what people within a particular economy, what they're directing their efforts towards. So the kinds of activities that they're doing. And it's also true that you can only sell what someone will buy from you. So that's the situation that we found ourselves in. And I'm glad that Richard mentioned that. So as a result of some things to do with perhaps our colonial history, but just economic history, there was a particular kinds of products that the world was interested in buying from us, and that's how our economies were shaped or structured towards. But then also the other direction where we were receiving the more higher value manufactured products that have closer links to wealth and incomes. So that's the question that the AFCFTA is trying to answer. That's the problem it's trying to solve, really, because the question is, I mean, when you look at African trade, Africa's trade with the world is dominated by commodities, like we've all observed today. But when we trade amongst ourselves, it seems like we trade a bit. I mean, it's limited trade, but then even the trade that happens is a bit more of higher value goods. So I'd like to give the example that people may not be interested in buying a computer made in Nigeria in the world, but it's possible that someone in Kenya might be interested in buying a computer made in Nigeria. And I looked at some trade map data just a few days ago, and I was looking at Africa to Africa trade. It was a pleasure to see that part of the higher value goods that are being traded includes shipments, which we have some production capacity in Nigeria. I mean, it's always good to see something good about Nigeria because there are not many things out there. But then I'm going to preface my comments really reflecting on the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that when I continue, I'm going to address some of the things that Richard brought up. So really, when I think about the COVID-19 pandemic, I think about it in two ways. I think about inequalities, first of all. So we have income inequalities, we have also health inequalities, but also the vaccine inequalities issues that came up. But we also have things around opportunity and just being ready for changes in the economy, because you had a lot of reshoring and also people looking for other sources of some goods that at that time Africa wasn't in the best position to respond to. So when other options or alternatives for the supply of some goods were being sought out, we're not able to respond to that because we're not ready. I'll start with inequality, and I think that this may speak to the issue that was also raised by Richard when it comes to the transformative effects of trade. So the truth is that a lot of our economies are not structured in the ways that they're supposed to. So we saw that in the US, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic and afterwards, there was a transfer of wealth from the lower economic classes to the high economic classes. It just showed that, I mean, it's something that we're already quite aware of, but then it just brought it into stark contrast or reality that, you know, the structure of that economy was not the best. And one of the few advantages of late development in Africa is that we should be able to learn from others. And that's the first point I want to make. It's very important to learn from others. A lot of people have gone ahead of us. They have had some successes, had some failures, but we need to learn from them. Even in terms of regional integration, we know that the European Union met some challenges, you know, some years ago with Brexit. So it's very important to learn the successes and the failures of integration efforts, the successes and the failures of trade integration efforts, but just how difficult it might be to cooperate or coordinate on supranational levels, and just how to mitigate for some of the challenges that may come up. So that's the first thing I want to make. The second point I want to make is about inclusivity. So trade, you know, can be good or bad, right? So trade can actually increase inequalities if it's not managed properly, and it can even lead to more exclusion if it's not managed properly. And I think about this in a few levels, on a few levels. So for Africa, we have countries that are different levels of development. I mean, on average, quite low to medium levels, but then still there is some variation within the continent. And it's quite important that even as we embark on this project to integrate our economic sectors through trade, it's important that we pay enough attention to the variations within the continent. And that's how you make sure that you don't get somewhere down the line and you have some countries opting out of the agreements because they feel that it does not benefit them. We can't deceive ourselves about this reality. We need to control for it. We need to respond to it. Inclusivity also even comes within the countries where on the regional level you have imbalances in many countries. So I come from Nigeria, and in Nigeria there are imbalances between the north and the south. And it's just the reality that when you talk about trade integration, it often just focuses on maybe the city regions, the places that are a bit more advanced, and then it leaves the other sides out of it. And we've seen a very real repercussion of that in Nigeria. For example, the Boko Haram crisis can be linked directly to social deprivation in parts of the north, and how that allowed for the insurgency to emerge and even to be sustained because there are not many alternatives for some people in the region. And even now we have another issue, the banditry, which is also linked to the lack of inclusion of particular members of our population into the economic system. So it's very important that we think about inclusion in the AFCFTA, and it's linked to the issue of women and young people. I know people always talk about women and youth, but it's really about how you make sure that the gains of the AFCFTA are not accruing, you know, just to the top, more or less, but then they're being they're being distributed one way or the other across the continent so that it's actually bringing prosperity and it's actually being transformative. So when you talk about women and youth, I think it's a lot about the firms that have been included in the AFCFTA. So we have some large firms that are better positioned to take advantage of agreements like this because they can invest in transportation because we have high cost of transportation. But then how do you make sure that even the smaller ones, the SMEs, are embedded in those, like we said, the regional value chains perhaps, you know, and it's something that we have to be we have to do very intentionally, right? Because it's not going to happen automatically. So we need to really think about inclusivity, not as an afterthought, but more as a feature, because one thing that we need very desperately on the continent is jobs. And the only way we can, create the right kind of jobs on the continent is not having jobs as an afterthought. So you think you do trade policy, industrial policy, then perhaps jobs would also grow. No, it doesn't always work like that. We need to be quite intentional about making sure that these things are happening. Then I was going to also mention innovative thinking. So it's true that, at the moment when you look at the world, a lot of things are happening and it's affecting us in many different ways. You have climate change, you have the war in Ukraine, but it just means that we need to think a little bit more innovatively. So in Africa, I can speak for Nigeria, for example, there's a growth in the services sector. I know that there is some talk about industries without smokestacks. I mean, it can be debated to what extent they can be useful or not for Africa's industrial growth. But then, it may be time to, look back at some of the development policies that have been used in the past and see, okay, are there any ways to adapt these to our current realities? Because we do not have a choice. We need to move forward one way or the other. So what can we learn from what has happened before, and how can we adapt this to what is happening at the moment? And this also links to the issues with FDI, because I think sometimes you think about FDI as a silver bullet, and I'm glad that you also raised this, Richard, that FDI can be good or bad as well, if you don't take your time to shape it in the appropriate way. So for example, even in terms of locations and in terms of the way it's structured, and in terms of the knowledge transfer that you expect to happen, and in terms of, of course, capital flights, like you mentioned. So we need to really think innovatively and try to make sure that we're not just copying, we're learning, but not just copying, but then making sure that everything that we're pursuing is fit for purpose. A very important point to make, again, is cooperation and coordination. You also mentioned this, and this is a problem that is facing the AFCFTA at the moment. I mean, the last I checked, there's some hiccups with the negotiations, because with the rules of origin, it's gotten to a particular percentage, but then there's a little bit left. And it's because it's really clashing with some of the industrial policies for the countries that are members of the AFCFTA. And there's a reality that if we're going to embark on a project like this, to some extent, even our industrial policies have to be somewhat coordinated. But the question is who is going to be responsible for this? Because the AFCFTA Secretariat says that, they are member driven and they don't have the power to tell, countries what to do. I don't think it's about telling countries what to do. But for example, you have the AFDB, the African Development Bank, that has a lot of capital and financing, and you can perhaps use that to nudge countries in particular directions, and really to just make sure that our production structures are somewhat complementary, because this would, help us even move faster with things like the AFCFTA, and even in things like trying to attract the right kinds of investments into African countries. So we're not just all competing for the same small pool of investments. So that's something that I wanted to mention as well. Cooperation and coordination is going to be very key to Africa's success as far as trade goes. And then I think we need to invest more in understanding our world, right? There's a lot of things happening. And like you said, we are often quite vulnerable to external shocks, but these things have happened for a long time. The external shocks in many different ways, commodity prices, or whether it's a war somewhere, or pandemic. And I think we need to even get to a point where we're not just reacting, but then we see some of these things even as they're coming. So when the war in Ukraine happened, there were now some projections about how it might affect Africa. But I think Africa should take, or African countries and people like me, perhaps, and whoever is working in trade and development in Africa, needs to take a bit more agency in, looking ahead and seeing some of these things and figuring out how is this going to affect us, and then making a plan for it. So it doesn't meet us and then we are scrambling around and trying to figure out what to do, but then really looking ahead. So we know that as far as the world goes, some say power is shifting. When it comes to capital, you talk about the US and China. So we need to understand these actors even better, so that we're not just at the receiving end of whatever they are doing, but we are showing a bit more agency in the way that we address these issues. So yeah, these are some of the points that I'd like to raise, as far as the AFCFTA and Africa's recovery from COVID goes. It is possible, but like we've all said, there is a lot of work to be done. It's not going to happen by magic or automatically. It's really about investing the resources and being very strategic and innovative, making sure that we're including everybody, and then really iterating as we go and just adjusting as we go. So that we can have the objective of prosperity for all, shared prosperity on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tenny. I think you've complimented Richard very well in terms of your diagnosis of the issues. You have been just as realistic as Richard has been. I think you're both looking at intra-African trade and its potential for dynamism as a pathway forward. but you both are also being realistic in saying that that won't happen automatically through the AFCFTA or any such initiative. There has to be intentionality, there has to be the complementary policies and so on. But I think just as Richard anchored his comments on the international economy and referencing that Africa is an open economy, African countries have open economies and so on, and what happens in the international economy inevitably impacts African economies. I think what you have done, Tenny, is then to anchor your comments on African societies as well, because you've asked us to look at issues around income inequality, inclusion, regional disparities, gender, youth, all these the dynamics which contribute to social cohesion and so on, which you think important as well in looking at the role that trade plays in economic growth. What both of you have not really touched on so much, although Richard did allude to this a bit in what he said about illicit financial flows, in what he said about that much of these trade agreements with African countries like AGOA, I guess the EU, EPAs, etc., have been overhyped, and and so on. But both of you have not really said much about the kinds of international responses that is needed from Africa's development partners. Because what I see is that in every area, there is a contestation, for African countries to find the kind of space that they need, whether it's on trade, on finance, and so on. Suddenly we talked about, I did mention the WTO agreement this morning, but they do not go far enough. We know that in the key areas. So there's that contestation. So perhaps before I open the floor, Richard, you first, if you'd like to say something about what kinds of international responses are needed from Africa's partners. We see many initiatives. We see the debt sustainability initiative, the expectation of how SDRs would be allocated, etc. That doesn't happen. So what are you looking for from international partners? And Tenny, I'll come back to you with the same question. Richard first.
Yeah, David, thank you. I think it's an incredibly important question. I mean, the answer is a lot more, right? is the kind of simple answer to that question. I mean, I think the response to COVID-19 from the multilateral institutions, I think, has been pretty deplorable. I mean, if you look at the G20 debt service suspension initiative, which I think, amounted to, and which has now ended, of course, but amounted to something in the order of $10 billion across 73 eligible countries. I mean, this is a fraction of the increased levels of debt that countries had to accumulate during in response to the pandemic. And of course, it was not cancelled debt, it was suspended. So countries have to pay that back with interest over the coming years. So it was a long way short of being a magnanimous gesture, that's for sure. The SDR allocation, I think, was very important. That was a very important, I think, step forward. But as you say, given that special drawing rights are allocated based on the quota system, the countries that needed the most got the least, and that was particularly true of Africa, of course. And they've been talking about recycling now for 10 months. Nothing really has been. I mean, there's been a very minor, but nothing has been recycled. And as they're moving ahead, recycling is likely to take place through, for example, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that the IMF is setting up. But that has problems. The beauty of SDRs is that they are non-conditional. They're not, conditionalities are not attached to special drawing rights. As soon as you channel it through these lending windows or funds or whatever, they come with conditionalities. And we think that's an inappropriate use of SDRs in that sense, unless they change the rules in the IMF for these financing opportunities. I mean, I do think, and again, nothing really has happened, but I do think the use of SDRs to recapitalize regional development banks. And the African Development Bank has been very strong on this, actually, and very clear about the opportunities that would provide them is something we support very strongly, and I think more of that needs to be seen. So the financing side of it really fell significantly short, and of course on the vaccine front, you know, that has proved to be a disaster. You know, this mechanism, the COVAX mechanism, really clearly was not fit for purpose on the scale that we confronted with the COVID virus. And I, you know, obviously it's early. I haven't seen the final outcome, David, of the WTO. They agreed it at 5 o'clock this morning after you know, long and utterly non-transparent negotiations. So we haven't really had time to absorb it yet. But all the signs are that this is not a waiver that is going to help countries either now with COVID-19 or, more importantly, with future pandemics that are certainly going to come as well. So or to deal with similar issues in the context of the climate crisis and the need of access to appropriate technologies to do. So I think that looks pretty disappointing. And you know, given, and I think you know, there is a real disconnect now, I think, between what we all understand. There are a series of crises, and Teniola talked about the inequality crisis. We have these developmental crises. We have the climate crisis. You know, and they're all compounding each other, and they're all getting worse. And right now, the multilaterals are not really fit for dealing with the, and interestingly, someone like Janet Yellen said it at the IMF World Bank meetings in an address she made to the Atlantic Council, that these are not, they're just not, they don't seem to be equipped to deal with these kind of problems. And I think that's true. And I think I think we need a much more, I mean, you know, I put out a short book recently on calling for a case for a new Bretton Woods, and I think we can't tinker our way through the kinds of problems that we face now. We need a very serious reform. I agree with Teniola, and it's an important point. You know, the opportunities for South-South cooperation, not just in terms of sharing experiences, which I think are important, but also new mechanisms, both on the trade front and the financing front. We've already seen some of those on the financing front, new financial institutions like the New Development Bank and others. But I think scaling up some of these South-South arrangements, I think, is a big challenge for the developing countries moving forward. And I think there are real opportunities. And I think they need to do it, because I'm not convinced, I'm sorry to say, that the multilaterals will actually step up to the plate in terms of the scale of the problems we face.
Thank you, Richard. Teniola?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's really putting their money where their mouth is as far as global cooperation goes. Richard has mentioned that we saw all of the failures during the COVID-19 pandemic, how long it took, you know, for a proper global response to Africa's experience of that. But I want to talk specifically about climate change. So because climate change is something that is mentioned a lot when we talk about trade. So now Africa is trying to embark on this trade project with the AFCFTA. And then we know that we can only sell what we produce. So it means that we're going to need some form of industrial growth, right? And that is carbon heavy. So the reaction from the global community has been, you know, I mean, to me, it looks a little bit like a teacher with a cane, you know, threatening people that, you know, you can't do this and this and that. You need to make sure that your industrial development is green, which is very important, because we know that we feel the impacts of climate change even more than other parts of the world. But I think it's important for the global community to realize that they need to make some hard decisions. So as far as African industrial development goes, it means that we need the carbon space to do what we need to do, right? So they need to realize that there are some sacrifices that they need to make on their end if they're really committed to global cooperation and global advancement. You know, they have to inconvenience themselves, inconvenience their own productive class, so their own industries, in order to create the space that Africa needs to get to where it needs to be. So that's just one dimension of the, I mean, where there's some deficiencies in global cooperation, and where the approach to just African support or African cooperation may be a bit flawed and can be improved. And I think I'll just add that to everything that Richard has already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Teniola. And this point that you made is exactly the same point that I saw in a recent op-ed by the Prime Minister of Barbados. She uses almost exactly the same phrase about inconveniencing yourself, and so on. We do have a question here from Alex Smith, who is an LSE student from Newcastle. And his question is to both of you. He says, what do you think would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? Teniola, do you want to go first? And then Richard.
The one change of policy on the Africa level. I mean, I'd assume so.
You did not, I mean, Alex, of course, could be female as well, but there's no indication of at what level. It's a general open question. So perhaps you could look at it at international and African level.
So, I mean, there is a point to be made for, some growth in African protectionism. So this is now even African countries protecting their industries from other African countries to an extent. So coming from Nigeria, this happened with Nigeria. They were trying to grow maybe the rice production industry, and the way they went about that was very flawed. This has also happened with other countries in Africa, where they use sometimes non-tariff measures to try to block people from, or block other producers from within Africa from accessing their markets. So I'd say that if African countries, for example, Nigeria used to have a very strong import substitution policy, where rather than focusing on production and exports, they were always focusing internally and blocking people from coming in. If that's that policy changes, where it's more of a focus on exports and then less of a focus on trying to block everyone from getting in, then we can make more advancements. So it would even link to things like the experience at the ports. How easy is it to get things out of the country? It will just direct resources in a different way versus the way that they are now directed to. I think that would be a simple answer for me. So a lot more cooperation, really.
Thank you, Teniola. Richard?
Boy, I wish there were a silver bullet that I could kind of. I mean, I think it's similar. I do think we need to have a much more serious discussion of industrial policy on the continent. I mean, we know what we've been through before. We know there were failures before, and you don't want to avoid the failures of the past with an excessive use of import substitution that didn't really work, because you can never, at the level of development that most African countries are at, depend simply on domestic markets for growth engines. So we need a kind of discussion of the strategic use of industrial policy linked to current circumstances. And I think the climate issue there is very important. I think linking development with climate with industrial policy, I think has to be done, and I think it's the way to go. I think it will open up lots of opportunities. So thinking of industrial policy, both given the history, Africa's own history of their successes and failures, and also in the new context of the climate challenge, both mitigation and adaptation, I think if we're to invest a lot of time in there, I think that would be an area that merits much more heavy thinking. I mean, at the international level, developed countries should, practice what they preach, right? Essentially, that's what they need to step up on ODA. ODA is not a solution, but they've never lived up to what they promised they would give to the continent, and that's clear. And we need a different type of development financing mechanisms to ensure access at reasonable and sustainable rates. If we're going to meet the 2030, we've got 8 years left to meet the 2030 agenda. And we would argue in that context we need to see debt cancellation in large part. I don't think many African countries can achieve the kinds of growth rates we're talking about, particularly clean growth, given the burden of debt that most of them face. I don't see it as a possibility.
Thank you, Richard. Now there are about 5 or 6 questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read them out and ask you, Teniola, Richard, to take them as you may wish. I note that a couple of them are specifically on climate change. So, again, keep that in mind. It's becoming an important part of this discussion here. So the first question is from Ted Belger. And he says the structure of the continent's economy is mainly focused on primary agriculture. Is this not a huge internal factor which has held back its development? Their manufacturing and service sectors lag massively behind and are thought to be a huge factor for Western investment, I guess is the point here. Then the second question is from Uba Okonkwo, he's a regional liaison officer for Africa at the LSE Alumni Association. LSE Alumni Association, he says, you stated in your presentation that premature deindustrialization is a major challenge to Africa's sustainable development. In your view, to what extent will the effective implementation of the AfCFTA and inter-African trade address this problem? Then Anthony Valion asks, are there lessons we can learn from ideas discussed in 1970s with recent supply chain shocks disrupting supplies such as oil, gas, and grains? Should it be a priority for all African countries, for all countries, not just in Africa, to become self-sufficient in meeting their basic needs first, where they can, and trade their excess goods to help others? And then he also says to foster development strategically, including renewable energy transmission, low carbon goods and services as well. Then Craig Stock asks, in the face of increasing climate shocks to African agricultural output, to what extent do you see trade policy as important for future food security in Africa, particularly in the light of the risks of trade as highlighted by the loss of Ukrainian imports? Then Hannah Getachew asks, my question is, what ways can AfCFTA advance Africa's climate agenda? And then finally, Max Blashmasher asks, how do you view the economic impact that startups like Twiga Foods or Wasoko have on SMEs? I know that these are disparate questions, but I wanted to get everything in, and we still have about 8 minutes to go. So Tenny, why don't you go first and pick on any of the questions? You have the floor.
Thank you. So there was a question on commodities and what role they may be able to play or not in industrial development. And I'd say that, there is some research on even when as a country, perhaps your exports are focused on commodities, you can attempt to move up in the commodities value chain. So you can even try to add more value to whatever it is. If, for example, if it's an agricultural produce, you can look more at, adding processing to whatever you're doing to that. And it's usually an easy enough place to start from versus trying to create entire new industries. So while commodities have really put African economies in a tough position, they still have opportunities that can be explored, as far as moving up the value chain goes, as far as increasing complexity in their production goes, because you already have obviously the raw material and you don't have to bring it from anywhere. The AfCFTA and industrialization, I think, it's really about, so the AfCFTA, I like to remind people that the AfCFTA is not about Africa just deciding that they want to trade, African countries deciding that they only want to trade amongst themselves. It's the reality that the world is at the moment not very interested in buying certain things from African countries. But perhaps if African countries start by trading those things amongst themselves, they will grow their capacity in such a way that they'll become more competitive on the global platforms or in global trade. So the end goal is still global trade, right? But the AFCFTA as a starting point. So that's linked to industrialization, because when you start to trade higher value goods, when your industries grow, then you sort of like, I mean, it's supposed to be about structural transformation and just taking the economy away from the lower value production to higher value production, because you get more for higher value goods than lower value goods, and they are more competitive in those markets. So that's a link between the AFCFTA and industrialization in Africa. Self-sufficiency in production, I don't know, because I mean, it'd be good to hear from Richard about this, but I mean, in the current day or in the modern era, I'm not sure there are many countries that can produce everything that their citizens need. I think that's going to be quite difficult. So it's really about, I guess it's about having flexible sometimes supply chains, knowing that, I mean, having several options. So for example, if it was possible, when there's something going on somewhere, you can switch to another place, then things might have been a little bit easier. So it's just about increasing everyone's capacity, really, because if Africa was producing at the level that it ought to be, even the world would have more options as far as trying to redirect demand and supply for some of the things that we need. Climate change, trade policy, and food security. Very important, because some of my work even focuses on the Lake Chad Basin, where the Boko Haram crisis is domiciled. And in the Lake Chad Basin, you see a combination of both insecurity and food security and climate change. So food security in the sense that both climate change and insecurity have affected the ability of farmers and even fishers to access their grounds. And then that is even affecting trade, because there was a lot of trade in the Lake Chad Basin. The Lake Chad Basin is Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Cameroon. So I guess the answer to that question very simply is just that, yes, we have to be looking at the connections between these things, even as we design our policies, and make sure that the policies respond adequately to the different dimensions of the issues. So that's what I'd say on that. The AFCFTA and the climate agenda. Just back to my point on late development. So with the AFCFTA, African countries are at a starting point of trying to begin to grow their economies, grow their economic structures in a particular direction. It will benefit us in the long run if the building blocks are the right kinds of building blocks. So if if we have the right kinds of policies, I mean that our industrial growth is a bit more sustainable, so we don't run into issues somewhere down the line. So I'd say that that's the link between the AFCFTA and the climate agenda. We just have an opportunity that for some other parts of the world now, they have to really like go back and start redoing things, but we are at the starting point in many respects. So we have an opportunity to do things right now, because I mean, even if you forget the world, it's also about us and the effects of climate change on our people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Teniola. Richard?
Yeah, I think underlying a lot of these questions, I mean, you know, what all African country, or any country really has to do at that level of development is to raise its productivity. Productivity is a very key concept in this story. But and it's a source of rising incomes and growing employment opportunities if it's done properly. Because if it's not done properly, of course, rising productivity can come at the expense of jobs. And as Teniola rightly pointed out, jobs is one of the big issues across the continent. In workforces that are highly informal and therefore low productivity, a key challenge is to get people out of that informal sector and into more formal work, which is higher productivity and better paying. And that really is, and that's true in agriculture as much as it's true in the urban economy as well. So and you can only square that kind of circle, of course, if you have a growth rate that is reasonably high. I mean, you to have rising productivity with rising employment, you need strong growth. And of course, in the world that we're talking about, that growth, we want to be green growth, or, it needs to be fueled by a different kind of energy system than the one that we've seen lead to rising wealth in today's advanced economies. And that's the challenge. And it's it's a huge challenge. I don't think we should underestimate the size of that challenge. And the need for international support do it properly. I think again, emphasizing that international dimension you raised, David, is critical if this is going to happen in a way that doesn't reinforce inequalities, that doesn't lead to the polarizations that we've seen in recent years. And I think the CFTA offers opportunities. Of course, I think it really does, but it's not automatic. It needs to be strategic, and it needs to be coordinated. I mean, there needs to be real coordination, and those pose not just logistical problems, but political problems that still need to be overcome. But I think it's the right way to go. I think we just have to, it just requires a lot of strategic thinking, and it does require an effective secretariat. I think there is an attempt now to create a secretariat linked to the CFTA. I do think that's important because these issues have to be coordinated. Just on the trade policy, we worry a lot that the kind of direction that the advanced economies are going, and I think we've seen that in the WTO this week, are not necessarily going to make life easier when it comes to food security or climate change in developing countries. The idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is coming down the road, is going to make meeting some of these structural challenges all the more difficult for developing countries, unless again it comes with appropriate financial compensation, because the dirty industries have already gravitated to the south. That's just a fact. That's why the north thinks it's doing a good job itself, because it's outsourced carbon intensive activities to developing countries, and then complains about developing countries actually producing increased emissions. I mean, this is classic hypocrisy, really. But if we're going to deal with that problem properly, we need financing to ensure that developing countries can make the adjustment without reinforcing the divisions and tensions that already exist. And so I think it's very important that African countries and African policymakers not only worry about what happens in the CFTA, but also worry about the direction that the multilateral trading agenda will be going over the next. I think what happened this week was essentially kicking the can down the road, David. I don't think they solved any problems at all. I think they essentially kicked the can down the road, and African policymakers need to have a very clear idea about where that road is going if they don't want to get screwed in the process, basically.
Yeah. No, you're quite right. Some key issues were left to 2023. It remains to be seen if they'll be dealt with then. But I think we've come to the end of our time, and my thanks to our speakers, Richard and Teniola, and to you, the audience, for joining this event, and especially to those in the audience who sent in questions and comments. Now, please feel very welcome to join future LSE events on Africa, both online and in person, if possible. Please also be on the lookout for our new book, to be published early next year. The title is Africa Trade Policy Review 2023, How the Pandemic Impacted African Trade, from the Trade Program at the Feroz-Laji Institute for Africa. And this book will discuss many of the issues covered in this session. So once again, my thanks to all. And I think it's been a great discussion, many insights, and I'm sure that many have taken away important points to think about. So thanks to all, and wishing you a great rest of the day.